Welcome to EdTech Monday Uganda, brought to you by the Mastercard Foundation in partnership with the Innovation Village through the EdTech Lab. EdTech Monday Uganda is a platform to engage Uganda's EdTech community and other relevant stakeholders, including the government, the private sector, and donors, on the emerging topics of education and how technology can address these challenges. EdTech Monday will be held once every month as we dissect the education sector, the future of education, and the available opportunities to grow this sector. Now, in this edition in 2019, UNESCO adopted a recommendation supporting the creation, use, and adaptation of inclusive and quality open educational resources and facilitating international cooperation in this field. In this episode, we will discuss the challenges and opportunities surrounding the realization of open educational resources relevant to Uganda. And joining me in the studio are three experts to discuss this topic. Let us introduce ourselves, starting with Peter.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kibadi Peter, and I've worked in the educational sector in Uganda and the whole of East Africa region for the last 15 years. My current job with Ubongo as a country representative is about ensuring that Ubongo content, which is a free content, is distributed to all those who need it at all time. I'm very passionate about EdTech because I believe it's one way of democratization of education.
Good afternoon, viewers. My name is Tito Okumu. I have been involved in educational technology for a period of over 20 years, where among others, I was also the e-learning manager at Makerere University. I've also been involved in the development of instructional content. I've also been involved in designing online instruction materials for various institutions, both in Uganda and outside Uganda. I've worked with the OER Africa, which is part of the South African Institute of Distance Education. I'm at the moment employed as an educational consultant, and I'm glad to be here to discuss this topic of OER with you. Thank you.
Hello, viewers. My name is Gerard Businge Atenyi. I'm a learning facilitator and the team leader at Ultimate Multimedia Consult and Yaka Digital Network, which is a platform with digital content. We have digitalized the Uganda curriculum and a set of tools for digitalizing teaching and learning, offline and online. For the past more than 11 years, I've also been supporting teaching and learning of multimedia journalism and digital communication at Makerere University. Happy to be here.
All right. Thank you so much, our guests, for those brief introductions. Now, a lot of people do not know what open resources for education actually look like. And I want to start with you, Peter. What is it that you mean when you say open resources for education? And how do you do it in your field?
We have this content whether online, whether offline, whether in a book format, whether in a digital format, where everyone can access it for free, so long it's not for commercial purposes. Let me add that one so that people may not mistake me. It's not for commercial purposes, but it's available for families, for children, for institutions, and for organizations who work with the kind of the target group we are working with.
I want to bring Gerald in on this conversation in terms of open resources. What role does technology play in making these resources open to everyone? And just how do the end users interact with open resources and how do they deal with them?
Of course, technology helps in distribution. The ability, imagine this content was developed, let's say, here in Kampala. How does it reach local people in Kotido, in Arua? So technology helps us to be able to put it in a digital format, either online or offline, and can be accessed by people from wherever they are. But also the ability, because part of what makes open these resources useful is the ability for people to reuse, remix. So digital technology also makes it easier for people to modify this content, remix it, and be able to meet their learning needs in their specific localities.
Thank you so much, Gerard, for that. I want to bring in Tito now in terms of scale. I know that Gerard mentioned how content can be accessed, but in terms of the scale of content, and knowing that you have a background in dealing with scaling content across the country, just how can open resources be scaled so that they can be accessible for everyone in the country during this lockdown?
Open educational resources are available both on online and offline. One of the projects which was run by the Open University of Commonwealth Open University was that of TESA, Teacher Education in Sub-Saharan Africa, which actually created content for primary schools. Now, in our case here, we must look at whether, one, how accessible are the digital content to those who are not accessible to them. Two, whether the use of the digital content is also is possible. Now, during this lockdown, a lot of issues have risen. One of them was that, yes, access has been limited. Two, use has been limited. Now, if you use IT, you require very good connectivity to ensure that you access content. So one of the things which we can do at the moment is to try and get the off content to these schools so that you have wider circulation. Among others, you could have them either in CD format or other formats which are available for low-resourced internet access. But for where the internet is accessible and where there are no power outages, digital access would be much easier than analog access.
But I want to bring Peter back into the conversation. Peter, the thing about education, particularly for young children, is that it requires a level of interactivity. If you could tell us, just from example's sake, from Obongo and Akili, how do young people interact with this content that you've been putting out there? And what kind of feedback loops have you had from the young people from this information that you've been giving to them openly?
Let me first clarify that Ubongo, we don't make content out of blue. It's a very, very long process. And all the content we make, we involve the children from the beginning. That means we do what is called co-creation. We create the content with kids. If you see Akili and me, Ubongo kids, those are real people who are there, real children who are with us through the whole process. They tell us this is the topic that we feel we want, whether it's mathematics, whether it's science, whether it's alphabet, or whether it's literacy. Then when you finish that process, you go to the team, the studio team, which is a whole process, a lot of people involved. Then before you launch the final product, you go back to the same people and go through the content and say, wow, that one was not from us. So it's a whole process of interaction, phototyping, creation, co-creation. And remember, like Ubongo, we have operations in 18 countries. So I'm talking to children in Uganda, my colleague is talking to children in South Africa, and the other colleagues are talking to children in Kenya. So by the end of it, we are creating a Pan-African content. And that's why Ubongo Blood is very famous, because it's not a Uganda blood, it's not a Tanzanian blood, it's a Pan-African content.
Thank you so much, Peter. I want Gerald to chip in here. The pandemic has really exposed the fractures we have in society now. Whilst we're talking about open access to resources, some people don't even have the gadgets to be able to access these open resources, even if you made them available. Some people do not have the connectivity required to access these devices. What can we do in the meantime to make sure that there's democracy in access to these open resources in education during this lockdown?
First of all, you've raised a very important issue of access. So one is whether the content is available, following relevant content, following the education needs of the country. If we can organize it and let it be available. Then the issue of access, my colleague has already talked about enabling both online and offline access. This is very, very important. It's good to put the things online, but there are also other ways to distribute digital content on memory cards, on CDs, beyond the internet. we must be able to do that leap. But also, most importantly, we would want to see policy mechanisms that really support this move towards more digital content access through, of course, availing people much good access to internet that is fast enough, but also prices of gadgets, because we usually look at content, gadgets, and the other important issue is about learning facilitation, because the promise of open education resources is both on access to content, helping learning and teaching, but also the ability to assess.
Raymond, I wanted to jump in there on that issue of the question you have asked my colleague. I believe, even as ourselves, we need to break down these terminologies. What is open educational resources? What are those? And so that someone can understand. Like give an example. I sit in Kampala. I have radio stations like in West Nile broadcasting the Ubongo content. I have never met them. I don't know them. They just go to online, and within 5 minutes, they have got the content. They have got the requirement on how to go about it. So on our side, we need to make this process as simple as possible. So all the time, we need to ourselves also, as producers of this content, not only produce good content, but understand the terrain we are working with, and engage the stakeholder on the ground to see what is it they want and on which platform are they available to them, so that all the time we are innovative. It's a very, very challenging field, and it needs everybody to be involved, but also as the producer of this content to not just sit in our office and think that we know it all. It's people who are on the ground who know it all.
Thank you so much for that intervention. It's a really good one. But I want us to take a very short break. When we get back in the second part, we're going to really discuss the idea of scaling open resources across the country during the lockdown. But also I want us to discuss how to simplify the education experience for the learners during this pandemic period. Let's take a very short break, but when we get back, we'll discuss those two. Thank you so much for staying with us on the EdTech Mondays. We're discussing the role of open resources in EdTech, and particularly learning during this pandemic. Just before we broke off, Tito wanted to make a very important submission on the top-down approach to education and open resources. I just want you to make that addition, and then we can continue the conversation.
One of the challenges we have in the country is that open education resources started from the top, or it came in through donor agencies. And a lot of people have not understood what it does, what happens when you have open education resources. And some of them have only been able to appreciate open education resources through use, because they find it there and is available. But I think the challenge is that, one, someone has to champion it at the Ministry of Education, so that we have a policy in place to take into consideration that open education resources are a useful idea which should be formalized in the country. The second one is to sensitize as many people as possible on the aspects of educational resources which can be used openly and what challenges they are there. Because I think the fear has been always that, the issue of licensing and things like that. This needs to come out very clearly to all those who want to implement open education resources.
Thank you so much, Tito. So let's go straight into this with Peter. Just how do we simplify content so that it's easily accessible to anyone and everyone that accesses it? But also, I want you to talk really from the broad sense in terms of scale. How does a child in Pader district receive content and understand it the same way a child in Kampala, in Muyenga would understand it?
I think one thing we have to understand and agree, all of us, is that education cannot be left to one institution, one person, one sector. This needs a multi-pronged approach. Like one of the things we need to look at is to make sure that you have as many partners as possible. That I can sit in Kampala and I have colleagues here in all corners of Uganda who are ambassadors of Ubongo and understand why do we need this. So I think it's very important to continue engaging as many partners, many stakeholders, starting from parents, because that's where our main focus should be, that because the child starts from home, schools, educators, the Ministry of Education, the district, so that everyone understands what are you doing and why are you doing it, and what impact, that's the most important thing, what impact does it have on the learning journey of the child.
All right, thank you so much for that addition, Peter. I want to get to Gerard now. You've been in this EdTech space for slightly over a decade. What kind of policy environment have you found? What kind of bottlenecks have you found that need to be overcome to make the place a more harmonious place, but also to make it easy and accessible for any and everyone that wants to access it?
For me, in terms that at the basic level, you're looking at access to gadgets. I wish there was a policy to equip as many school-going children with a digital gadget that can access multimedia content. At the other level is the issue of internet cost. The internet cost in Uganda is still high because in as much as we advocate for offline, we know content needs to be updated every now and then. There are new resources that are coming up. So internet access, at least for some time, is important in the strategy. So having many people with the ability to connect and download resources and update and do assignments and submit them would go a long way in making these open education resources readily available, but also other education resources that might not be open.
Thank you so much, Gerard, for that. And you raise a very important point on having at least each child access a digitally accessible gadget. Tito, I want to come to you again because really in terms of scale and ability of scale in the country, you'd have a good experience in that and good knowledge. What do you think should be done to improve this access and scale for young people, and particularly to gadgets that have multimedia devices on them?
First of all, I want to agree with my fellow panelists who say that we need to involve as many stakeholders as possible. It is not good to leave the learning scenario to only the teachers. We need to involve everybody both at the political and the academic level, so that when these people are in place and they are involved, we can actually scale these things up country. So we have radio stations all over. Certain content can be produced through radio stations. Where there is no radio station in the neighborhood, we could have CDs or devices which can be read offline. We don't need to depend so much on only internet. We need to have devices which can read. If you have a tape recorder, you have a device which can pick information, an ICT device which can pick information. This can be used to receive content.
Thank you so much, Tito. And I know I want to bring Peter in. Many times when we talk about scale, we only talk about what the role of the government is. But I want you, Peter, to speak towards what's the role of the private sector. And maybe this is a question that also Gerald can attempt. But let's start with Peter and then we'll go to Gerald.
I think, Rainbow, to answer that question, I'll first be give you my own view that education is too big, too important, too crucial to be left to government alone. That is one fallacy I don't believe in. And I think that is one area you have touched, which is we should think very critically, all of us, the role of the private sector. Because the private sector touch all of us in one way or another, whether it's the product we use at our home, whether it's the services we use at our home. And I think as part of giving back to the community, they should be involved in this, because it's about the education of the country.
Gerald, if you could also just speak what role that private sector can play, and also what exactly can government do to enable the private sector to take up a bigger role in advancing access to open education resources?
So I believe the education is a very big market, and people need to learn today. They need to learn 5 years later. We need to see many actors coming up in this development of content. If you visited the website for the Ministry of Education e-learning or NCDC, you can see they have done quite some commendable job, but there are also quite a lot of gaps. And if you also look at why people are not accessing this kind of content, living to the promise of the digital platform, being able to avail audio, video, text, animations is quite a challenge. It takes a lot of resources, and I believe the government could do funding for primary open education resources to be availed for each level, but for ongoing quality content and enhancements and the interactivity and engagement that is needed in learning today, we need to see more private sector players coming up to develop these kinds of platforms like we are doing with Yaka, to avail content, but also avail assessment, avail teachers to provide ongoing support for learning. And while we have goals of reaching everyone, the truth of the matter is it's step by step. Even UPE has not attracted everyone to school.
All right, thank you so much, Gerald, and thank you so much, guys. But I now want you to make your concluding remarks, and I want to start with you, Tito. What are your concluding remarks on this topic before we wrap up?
Thank you very much, moderator. To me, the first thing is to have a policy in place. Without policy, we shall just have erratic OER being implemented. The second issue, which is also very important, is to find ways of motivating the people who are practicing OER. Without motivation, nobody is going to be very keen about this. Number three, which I could also add in, is that if government could encourage the private sector to put up resource centers at major towns, this would be a very good place where repositories of OER can be made. At the moment, the libraries are not there. There are no repositories. The only repository we have are at the universities. So if we could expand repository centers, there would be more access to these things, so that even someone up country knows there's a repository, let's say in Moyo, that repository is accessible to everybody, and people in Moyo can walk in there and get access to these things. To me, cascading these things downwards will be a better way of ensuring that more people can actually access open education resources. Open education resources is actually in multimedia form. So we don't need to confine it to only the digital form. We can confine it to non-digital forms as well, so that we are able to reach as many people as possible.
Thank you so much. Gerald, what are your concluding remarks on this topic?
For me, it is really to emphasize the importance of good content in learning and teaching and education in general, that we need probably open education resources to be prepared, availed, updated to as many people as possible, and distributed with all these mechanisms we talked about. But most importantly, that we need people who can do this. The cost that goes in, I see that the private sector will play a very big role, companies like ours and several others, in preparing content on an ongoing basis. The other issue, of course, relates to the whole expectation of education on government. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to appeal to you very humbly that while government can do quite a lot, and we expect a lot from them as their responsibility to citizens, government is constrained with so many needs, and every parent, every child, every guardian needs to think about the learning of their child and utilize every available opportunity to ensure that that learning is taking place, whether in school or out of school.
All right, thank you so much, Gerald. Peter, what are your concluding remarks on this chapter?
At Ubongo, our mission is to reach 550 million African kids with the localized learning content. That's what we are heading to. And that's why we open up our content to be accessible, available in the shortest time and format to children all over the world. Because our mission is many children learning, especially the challenges of African children are facing on a daily basis. And from experience, since we went open last year, our content have reached 24 million children. That's a very big number in a very short time. So we are going to continue doing that, make sure that our multi-platform media, whether it is using the TV or using radio or printables or USBs, is accessible to our children across the continent.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so much, Gerard. Thank you so much, Tito, for joining us for this edition of EdTech Mondays. Of course, this is a monthly conversation where we discuss the future of education will look like using technology. But most importantly, this conversation is brought to you by the Innovation Village in partnership with the Mastercard Foundation. Have yourselves a good day.